There's a scene in Thriller Bark where Zoro, having secretly absorbed all of Luffy's near-fatal injuries onto his own body using a technique that transfers pain and damage from one person to another, stands back up after taking damage that should have killed several people and simply says he's fine. Nobody around him knows what he actually just did to himself. He never tells them. He just stands there, bleeding internally in ways that will nearly end his life, and insists everything is fine, because telling the truth would mean someone might try to stop him, or worse, might try to help. Fans consider this one of the greatest displays of loyalty in the entire series. I don't disagree that it's loyal. I just think it's also one of the clearest examples in modern anime of a person who has built an entire identity around never letting anyone see him hurting, and I want to talk about why that's worth being careful with. Zoro is, on the surface, one of the most straightforwardly admirable characters in One Piece. Unshakable discipline. A singular, lifelong goal: become the world's greatest swordsman that he pursues with total consistency from his first appearance to his most recent one. Loyalty so absolute it borders on self-annihilating. A refusal to ever complain, ever ask for help, ever let pain slow him down. He's become, over the decades, a kind of shorthand for silent competence. The guy who doesn't talk about the work, just does it, no matter what it costs him. And there's real substance behind that reputation. The show backs it up constantly, showing him training while everyone else sleeps, taking on fights nobody else can survive, absorbing damage that would end most people. But I want to separate the admirable parts of that from the parts that are actually a coping mechanism dressed up as virtue, because I think they get bundled together far too easily by people who want to be more like Zoro. Let's start with the single goal focus because it's the most obviously appealing part of the character and also the part I think is most misunderstood. Zoro decided, as a child, after the death of his childhood friend and rival Quina, that he would become the world's strongest swordsman in her honor and in fulfillment of a promise they made to each other. That's a beautiful origin, genuinely, grief transformed into purpose, a promise kept across an entire lifetime. But notice what that decision actually forecloses. From that point forward, essentially every other dimension of Zoro's life gets organized entirely around that single goal. He doesn't really have hobbies outside of training. He doesn't pursue romantic relationships. The show treats this as comic relief more than anything, but structurally, it means an entire category of human connection simply doesn't exist for him. He doesn't process grief, doesn't sit with uncertainty, doesn't really have an interior life the story lets us access outside of his relationship to strength and to his goal. He is, more than almost any other character in the cast, defined entirely by a single vector of ambition, and everything else about him, his loyalty, his stoicism, his refusal to show weakness, exists in service of protecting that one vector from anything that might interrupt it. This matters because having one clear goal and pursuing it relentlessly sounds, on its face, like extremely good advice. Focus. Discipline. Know what you want and don't get distracted. But watch what that focus actually costs Zoro across the story, and you start to see a pattern that's less about admirable dedication and more about a person who has organized his entire emotional life around a goal specifically because the goal is safer than the alternative, actually being present with people, actually being known, actually risking the kind of vulnerability that comes with wanting things you might not get and people you might lose. Quina's death is the formative wound of Zoro's entire character, and instead of processing that loss through connection with other people, he converts it entirely into solitary discipline. He never really talks about her. He never seems to grieve her, on screen, in any way that isn't immediately redirected into training harder. The goal becomes not just a dream, but a wall, and the wall has been up since he was a child. Now let's talk about the running joke that's actually not that funny if you think about it for more than a few seconds. Zoro's absolutely legendary sense of direction, or rather, his complete and total lack of one. It's played entirely for comedy throughout the series. He gets lost walking in a straight line. He ends up on the opposite side of an island from where he's supposed to be. Other characters have long since stopped being surprised when he wanders off in exactly the wrong direction. It's a great running bit. But there's something almost too perfect about the metaphor sitting underneath it. Here's a character defined by an almost superhuman refusal to ever ask anyone for help or directions, who as a direct consequence, is constantly, comically lost. He'd rather wander for hours in the wrong direction than stop and ask someone which way to go. That's funny in the context of navigating an island. It's a lot less funny as a metaphor for how he handles literally every other kind of difficulty in his life, which is exactly the same way. Total refusal to seek outside input, total insistence on figuring it out himself, no matter how long it takes or how much unnecessary suffering it causes along the way. Now let's get to the real center of this argument, because everything else has been building toward it. The thriller Bark arc, and specifically what Zoro does there, because I think it's the single clearest piece of evidence in the entire series for the case I'm making. Luffy, during the fight against Moria, takes catastrophic damage, the kind of damage that would kill him. Zoro finds him near death, and makes a decision, alone, without discussing it with anyone, without giving Luffy or Chopper or Robin or anyone else the chance to weigh in. He uses a technique to transfer all of Luffy's fatal injuries onto his own body. All of them. Every wound, every internal injury, everything that was about to kill his captain, Zoro absorbs into himself instead, and then stands up, walks back to the crew, and tells everyone he's fine. He doesn't say what he did. He lets Chopper treat him for what appears to be normal battle damage, actively concealing the true extent of what's actually happening inside his own body, right up until his organs start failing, and it becomes impossible to hide any longer. Sit with the actual mechanics of that choice for a second, separate from how triumphant the scene is framed to feel. Zoro made a unilateral decision to take on wounds that would kill a normal person, wounds so severe that even his own extraordinary durability barely survives them, and then he actively deceived the people who loved him about what he'd done, for as long as he possibly could. This isn't loyalty extended honestly, where Zoro says, "I'm taking this risk, here's why, stay close in case it goes wrong." It's loyalty extended through concealment, a sacrifice specifically designed to be discovered only once it's already irreversible, because if anyone had known in advance, they might have tried to stop him, or at minimum, might have insisted on supporting him through it rather than letting him bear it entirely alone. He doesn't want support. He wants the sacrifice to be his, completely, uncontaminated by anyone else's involvement, because somewhere in his psychology, letting someone help him carry pain seems to register as a kind of failure that letting himself nearly die in total secrecy does not. This is, structurally, almost identical to the pattern we've talked about with other characters in this series of videos, just wearing a different costume. It's not vengeance, like Guts. It's not isolation dressed as detachment, like Gojo. It's self-sacrifice specifically engineered to avoid ever being witnessed, which means it can never actually be received as care by the people it's meant to protect, because they don't get to know about it until the crisis point, if they find out about the true extent of it at all. Luffy doesn't get the chance to say thank you in the moment, doesn't get the chance to say, please don't do that again, doesn't get to have any kind of reciprocal exchange around what just happened, because the entire act was constructed to happen in the dark, discovered only through consequence rather than through honesty. And here's the pattern worth naming directly, because it's genuinely common outside of fiction. People who were taught, somewhere along the way, that their pain is only acceptable if it's silent, that needing help is a kind of weakness that has to be hidden at all costs, that the purest form of care you can offer someone is one that costs you everything and asks nothing back, including the basic dignity of being seen while you're paying that cost. Zoro isn't written as someone who enjoys suffering. The show is careful never to frame him as masochistic, but he is written as someone for whom suffering silently has become so thoroughly normalized that the idea of doing it any other way, openly, with support, barely seems to occur to him as an option. And crucially, the narrative rewards this pattern almost every single time it appears. Zoro's silent endurance gets treated as the height of loyalty, the peak of what devotion to your crew looks like, rather than as a sign that something in how he relates to his own suffering might be worth examining. Compare Zoro's version of this to how other Straw Hats handle their own pain, because the contrast is instructive. Usopp is allowed to be scared, openly, repeatedly, without the narrative treating his fear as a character flaw to be overcome. His arc is about learning to act despite fear, not about learning to stop feeling it. Nami is allowed to cry in front of the crew, to ask for help directly, to have her vulnerability be a normal part of her relationships rather than something she has to hide until it becomes a medical emergency. Even Luffy, the captain, gets to openly grieve, openly panic, openly need his crew in moments of crisis. Zoro is nearly alone among the main cast in being denied, or in denying himself that same permission. His arcs are almost never about learning to let people in. They're about him enduring something extraordinary, alone, and the crew finding out afterward how much he sacrificed, and being moved by it. The show keeps building relationships around discovering Zoro's suffering retroactively, rather than around Zoro actually sharing it as it happens, and that's a meaningfully different emotional structure than the one most of the other characters get to have. There's another moment worth examining, earlier in the story but thematically identical. Zoro's fight against Mihawk on the way to the Grand Line, where he takes a devastating, nearly fatal wound directly to the chest rather than defend himself, because turning his back to run would violate his own private code about never showing his back to an enemy in defeat. He loses that fight badly. He nearly dies. And his response, immediately afterward, bleeding out on the beach, isn't to process the loss or accept help gracefully. It's to make Luffy promise that he'll become the world's greatest pirate, essentially converting his own near-death experience into another data point in his singular, all-consuming goal, rather than a moment that might prompt any kind of reflection about the cost of the code he's operating under. He turns his own trauma into fuel for the mission with almost mechanical efficiency, the same way Guts does, the same way Itachi buries grief under strategy. The specific flavor is different. Zoro's is about pride and codes of honor rather than vengeance or unilateral protection, but the underlying mechanism is identical. Pain gets processed by immediately converting it into purpose, never by simply being felt, witnessed, or shared. I think it's worth being honest about why this particular pattern is so appealing to audiences, because understanding the appeal is part of understanding why it's worth being cautious about. Zoro represents a very specific fantasy. The idea that you can be so disciplined, so self-sufficient, so quietly strong, that you never have to be a burden to anyone. That your pain can be entirely your own problem, managed entirely through your own willpower, never inconveniencing the people you care about. For anyone who's ever felt like their needs were too much, like asking for help was a risk not worth taking, like the safest way to love people is to never let them see you struggling, Zoro is an enormously validating character to watch, because the show consistently rewards exactly that instinct. He never gets punished narratively for hiding his pain. He gets admired for it. Everyone finds out eventually how much he sacrificed, and the discovery becomes a moment of the crew loving him more, not a moment of anyone gently telling him this isn't sustainable. But here's what I think gets missed if you're using him as a template, rather than just enjoying him as a character. The show can afford for this pattern to work out fine every single time, because it's fiction, and the plot needs Zoro alive and functional for the story to continue. Real life doesn't offer that same guarantee. In real relationships, the person who consistently hides how much they're struggling until it becomes an emergency isn't giving the people who love them a gift. They're giving those people a much harder, more frightening version of care. One where support only ever gets to arrive after the damage is already severe, rather than early enough to actually prevent it. Every time Zoro chooses silence over honesty, he's not just protecting himself from vulnerability, he's quietly deciding, on behalf of everyone who loves him, that they don't get the chance to help him until it's almost too late, which is a decision made unilaterally, exactly the same way Itachi makes decisions unilaterally about what Sasuke can handle. It's control disguised as toughness, and toughness is a much easier disguise to admire from the outside than control is. There's a version of discipline that's genuinely healthy, showing up consistently, doing the unglamorous work, not needing constant external validation to keep pursuing something you care about. Zoro has plenty of that, and it's worth admiring. But there's a different thing hiding right next to it in his character, which is the belief that needing anyone ever for anything is a kind of failure that has to be avoided at nearly any physical cost. Those two things get bundled together constantly in how this character gets talked about online. Just be disciplined like Zoro. Just grind in silence like Zoro. As if the silence and the discipline are the same trait, when they're actually two very different things that happen to live in the same body. You can absolutely take the discipline. Please leave the silence behind. Think about what it would actually look like if Zoro operated with the same commitment to his goal, but without the compulsive secrecy layered on top of it. He could still train obsessively. He could still pursue his singular dream with total consistency. He could still take on fights other people can't survive. But he could also tell Chopper the truth about his injuries in real time instead of hiding them until his body starts failing. He could tell Luffy what he's about to do before doing it, and let his captain decide whether he's willing to let Zoro make that sacrifice, instead of finding out after the fact and having no say in it at all. None of that would make him less strong. It would just make his strength something the people who love him could actually participate in, rather than something they only get to discover the scale of once it's already over. So if you're drawn to Zoro, and it's easy to be, he's one of the most quietly compelling characters in the entire medium, and his loyalty is genuinely one of the best qualities a person can have. Separate the loyalty from the secrecy that usually accompanies it. Loyalty that insists on being witnessed and shared is still loyalty. It's just loyalty that lets the people you love actually be there for you, instead of loyalty that protects them from ever having the chance. The strongest version of devotion isn't the one that hides the wound until it's nearly fatal. It's the one honest enough to say, before the wound happens, this might cost me something, and I'd rather you know that going in than find out after I've already paid it alone. That's a much less cinematic kind of strength. It's also the only kind that actually lets the people around you love you while you're still standing there to receive it. Let's go a little further into the psychology of the goal itself, because I don't think we've fully unpacked what it means that Zoro's entire identity is anchored to a promise made to someone who's already dead. Kuina dies before the story even properly begins. She falls down a flight of stairs, an almost absurdly mundane death for someone who was, up to that point, consistently beating Zoro in every sparring match they had. And instead of that loss becoming something Zoro has to grieve and eventually integrate into a life that moves forward in new directions, it becomes the permanent, unchanging axis his entire identity gets built around. He takes her sword. He commits, as a literal child, to becoming what she never got the chance to become, and he never revisits that commitment, never questions it, never allows it to evolve into anything more complicated than pure forward momentum, toward a fixed point. This is worth sitting with, because grief that gets converted immediately into a rigid, permanent goal often isn't actually grief being processed. It's grief being avoided through action, the same mechanism we already talked about with Guts channeling his trauma into vengeance instead of feeling it. Zoro doesn't have visible breakdowns about Kuina, the way a person working through genuine loss typically does. Moments of doubt, moments of anger at the unfairness of it, moments where the goal itself feels hollow because the person it was meant for isn't there to see it achieved. Instead, the goal simply becomes bulletproof, permanently installed, never examined again for the rest of the story. That kind of permanence isn't peace. It's often what avoidance looks like when it's dressed up convincingly enough that even the person carrying it stops noticing there's anything underneath. And notice what this buys him, functionally. A reason to never sit still long enough to actually process anything else that happens to him afterward, either. Every subsequent hardship, Mihawk's beating, the constant injuries, the Thriller Bark near-death experience, gets absorbed into the same undifferentiated mass of things that happen on the way to becoming the greatest swordsman, rather than being allowed to exist as their own distinct experiences worth reflecting on individually. The goal doesn't just give Zoro direction. It gives him a permanent excuse to never stop moving long enough to feel anything that isn't immediately useful to the mission. That's an extremely effective way to survive difficult things in the short term. It's a much less effective way to actually become a whole person who has genuinely metabolized what's happened to him, rather than just outrun it at an impressively consistent pace for over 2 decades of in-universe time. I want to talk, too, about how Zoro relates to weakness in other people, because I think it reveals something about how he actually feels about his own vulnerability, even though he'd probably never say it directly. He's generally patient and protective toward the newer, less battle-hardened members of the crew. He doesn't mock Usopp's fear or Chopper's timidity the way some characters might. But watch how he treats any suggestion that he himself might need the same patience extended back to him. He deflects it, minimizes it, physically removes himself from situations where his own injuries might become the center of attention. There's an asymmetry there worth naming. Zoro can extend grace to other people's vulnerability with total ease, but the moment that same grace gets offered to him, something in his system seems to reject it almost automatically. That's a very common pattern in people who've decided, somewhere early on, that their own needs are less legitimate than everyone else's. They become wonderful at supporting others precisely because support flowing outward doesn't require them to sit in the much more uncomfortable position of receiving it themselves. Think about the crew dynamic more broadly here, because it's actually structured in a way that reinforces this. Chopper is the doctor, which means Zoro's body becomes something to be fixed after the fact, rather than something whose limits get respected in the moment. Nobody on the crew is really positioned, structurally, to say, no, Zoro, you can't take on this fight, you're not at full strength, and have that actually stick. Because Zoro's entire currency within the crew is built on being the person who takes on fights nobody else can survive. If he started regularly deferring, resting, admitting limits, it would arguably threaten the exact role he's built his value around occupying. That's worth naming as its own trap. Sometimes the reason someone can't stop performing endurance isn't just personal psychology, it's that an entire social role has been built around them doing exactly that, and stepping back from it. Risks feeling like losing the thing that makes you valuable to the people you love. Zoro isn't just enduring pain silently because of some abstract code of honor. He's doing it because the one who takes the hits so no one else has to, has become the specific shape of how he's needed. And needed is a very hard thing to risk giving up once you've built an identity around being it. This is, again, a pattern that shows up constantly outside of fiction, particularly in people who occupy caretaking or strong one roles in families, friend groups, or workplaces. The role itself starts demanding its own maintenance. You become the person who doesn't get sick, doesn't get overwhelmed, doesn't ask for accommodations, because the entire system around you has quietly come to depend on you not doing those things, and admitting a limit starts to feel less like honesty and more like letting everyone down. Zoro's arc never really breaks this cycle. He gets stronger, he takes on bigger fights, the wounds get more severe, and the pattern simply scales up alongside his power level rather than ever being interrupted. That's worth noticing, because it means the show isn't actually depicting growth away from this pattern, it's depicting the same pattern getting more impressive and more dangerous in equal measure as the stakes of the story increase. So here's where I want to land this, because I think it's easy to hear all of this and assume the conclusion is don't be strong, don't be disciplined, don't be loyal. That's not it at all. The conclusion is closer to this. Strength that requires total secrecy to function isn't actually more impressive than strength that's allowed to be witnessed. It's just more isolating, for you and for the people who love you, and would very much like the chance to help carry something heavy alongside you, instead of only finding out about it once you're already bleeding out and trying to convince everyone you're fine. Zoro's discipline is genuinely worth admiring, his singular commitment to a goal worth admiring, his loyalty absolutely worth admiring. But the specific mechanism by which he protects all of that, silence, concealment, unilateral sacrifice, a near-total refusal to ever let his own pain be visible until it's unavoidable, that's not the part of him worth building your own personality around. That's the part of him that, if you actually lived it out in a body without plot armor, without a devil fruit doctor standing by, without a narrative guaranteeing you survive the wound, would eventually get you killed by something that honesty and a little bit of help could have prevented long before it became fatal. Be disciplined, be loyal, have a goal big enough to organize a life around. Just don't decide, the way Zoro has decided every single time it's mattered, that the people who love you only deserve to know how much you're hurting after there's nothing left for them to do about it. One final thing worth naming, because it ties everything back together. Notice how the show frames the moment Zoro's secret finally gets discovered at Thriller Bark. It's not framed as a failure of communication. It's framed as the emotional climax of the entire arc, Chopper's horror, the crew's devastation, the swelling music, all of it built to make you feel the full weight of what Zoro was willing to sacrifice. And it works, completely, as a piece of storytelling. But notice what that framing quietly teaches the audience about what love is supposed to look like. That the highest expression of devotion is the one that gets discovered rather than offered, the one that produces maximum emotional impact specifically because it was hidden until the last possible moment. That's a beautiful narrative structure. It's a genuinely risky way to actually treat the people who love you, because it only works if someone happens to find out in time, and real life doesn't promise you that timing the way a shonen manga does. If you want to take something real from Zoro, take the version of him that exists underneath the secrecy, not the secrecy itself. Take the discipline that shows up every single day whether anyone's watching or not. Take the loyalty that would genuinely put everything on the line for the people he cares about. Just build it on top of honesty instead of concealment, because that's the one piece of his character the story never actually lets him have, and it's the one piece that would have cost him nothing to give the people who loved him, while giving them everything they actually needed. The chance to help him carry it before it nearly killed him instead of only afterward, once the damage was already done.